nos motiva. Muchas veces, las conexiones que buscamos parecen estar fuera de nuestro alcance y embarcamos en un viaje siguiendo una nueva vida o para forjar nuevas memorias. Nuestra misión es crear esa conexión de manera segura. Su seguridad es nuestra pasión. La conexión humana agrega valor a nuestras vidas. Es un sentido de pertenencia que nos motiva. Muchas veces, las conexiones que buscamos parecen estar fuera de nuestro alcance y embarcamos en un viaje siguiendo una nueva vida o para forjar nuevas memorias. Nuestra misión es crear esa conexión de manera segura. Su seguridad es nuestra pasión. La conexión humana agrega valor a nuestras vidas. Es un sentido de pertenencia que nos motiva. Muchas veces, las conexiones que buscamos parecen estar fuera de nuestro alcance y embarcamos en un viaje siguiendo una nueva vida o para forjar nuevas memorias. Nuestra misión es crear esa conexión de manera segura. Su seguridad es nuestra pasión. La conexión humana agrega valor a nuestras vidas. Es un sentido de pertenencia que nos motiva. Muchas veces, las conexiones que buscamos parecen estar fuera de nuestro alcance y embarcamos en un viaje siguiendo una nueva vida o para forjar nuevas memorias. Nuestra misión es crear esa conexión de manera segura. Su seguridad es nuestra pasión. La conexión humana agrega valor a nuestras vidas. Es un sentido de pertenencia que nos motiva. Muchas veces, las conexiones que buscamos parecen estar fuera de nuestro alcance y embarcamos en un viaje siguiendo una nueva vida o para forjar nuevas memorias. Nuestra misión es crear esa conexión de manera segura. Su seguridad es nuestra pasión. La conexión humana agrega valor a nuestras vidas. Es un sentido de pertenencia que nos motiva. Muchas veces, las conexiones que buscamos parecen estar fuera de nuestro alcance y embarcamos en un viaje.
So welcome everybody. I'm Mark Ward. This is my credentials here. Today we're going to be talking about two topics. The first one's going to be the facilities, the air traffic facilities, ATC 101. The second presentation is going to be airspace and how the airspace is broken up within the United States. So let's start with the ATC 101 course first. We're going to break it down into the en route and the terminal portion, and also I'm going to talk about flight service stations and the command center. So first one's is the en route phase of flight. It's the Air Route Traffic Control System Centers, ARTCC, Air Route Traffic Control Center. As a pilot, we refer to it just as a center. We don't really say ARTC or en route, we call it the center. Anytime the pilots are going to talk to a center. Indianapolis Center, for example, or Atlanta Center is the names they use. There's 20 of them across the nation. They provide services in the en route phase of flight. Well, what's the en route phase? That's really anything above 10,000 feet, but it can be at a lower altitude. It's when you get away from major metropolitan areas, and that's the en route phase of flight. It provides radar approach control services at airports without approach control services. Your smaller airports away from major metropolitan areas. It does non-radar domestic services. It also does non-radar oceanic services for aircraft operating outside the radar range, traveling across the Atlantic, the Pacific, the Caribbean, or the Gulf of Mexico. Now recently in the Gulf of Mexico, we put a new system in there, ADS-B, Automatic Dependent Systems Broadcast, ADS-B. is the new system. It's a surveillance, satellite-based surveillance system that allows us to do ATC in the Gulf of Mexico. Hopefully in the oceans soon. This is what a flight progress strip looks like. It's got the aircraft call sign, it's got our type of airplane, equipment suffix, the speed of the airplane, a time over a fix. The fix is usually within the flight plan itself. Well, it is within the flight plan itself. The altitude, the flight plan route, and the transponder code. Now this is almost all that's included in a flight plan, but it doesn't have the color of the airplane, the souls on board, or the fuel on board. So, but it's everything I need as an air traffic controller to control the airplanes based on just what they are doing, what their route of flight is. The centers are broken down into the pieces of airspace. Each airspace is about the same as it was over 50 years ago. Not a lot's changed. We'll change a boundary here and there on a piece of airspace to allow for flows of aircraft. But just to give you some examples, Miami Center's down here. This is Jacksonville Center, Atlanta Center, Indianapolis Center, Chicago Center. This big one up here is Minneapolis Center. And just put it in contrast, you have this big one, Minneapolis Center, and over here is New York Center. New York Center is one of the smallest domestic pieces of airspace. However, they own all this airspace also. Same with Oakland Center. Oakland Center's got a big piece of domestic airspace, but they do all the Pacific also, all the way out beyond Guam. Now Guam has its own airspace. It's a terminal piece of airspace, but they interact with Oakland Center. So the airspace they own is 10,000 feet and above with exceptions. Well, I'd like to actually say almost 10,000 feet's becoming the exception. And what we've done is we've actually raised the ceiling of the terminal's airspace to give them more airspace. We call it the terminalization of airspace. And what we've done is places like Boston, New York, Atlanta, Chicago, Dallas, Los Angeles, we've taken the terminal airspace and moved it up. Sometimes as high as flight level 230, most of the time in the teens, 15, 16, 17,000 feet. And the reason for that is, in the terminal world, I need 3 miles and 1,000 feet between airplanes. In the en route world, in the en route phase flights, I need 5 miles between airplanes. So in order to get more airplanes in the same amount of airspace, we move it down to 3 miles. That way we can do more separation of airplanes, more airplanes. So that's why at the busy metropolitan areas, we've moved that airspace up from 10,000 feet. It used to be you could draw a straight line across the NAS at 10,000 feet. Terminals owned everything below, en route owned everything above. Things have changed. The data is digitally displayed, which means you guys have seen in movies where you see the radar sweep go around. Well, that doesn't happen. It's a continuous data update on the radar screen. You don't see that sweep going on. We use long-range air route surveillance radars. There's usually 10 to 13 radars that produce the picture for each one of the centers, and they're shared across the NAS. So the same images that you see in Atlanta Center, you might see also in Indianapolis Center because they're sharing radar sites at those two places. Target updates once every 10 to 12 seconds. So think about that for a minute. Very slow moving. It spins around once every minute, or every 10 to 12 seconds, I mean. So it goes around very slowly. The centers are all built in the late 50s, early 60s. They're all built in rural areas. For example, Chicago isn't really in Chicago. It's actually in Aurora, Illinois, which is about 35, 40 miles west of Chicago. Atlanta Center's in Hampton, Georgia, which is about 35 miles southeast of Atlanta. Cleveland Center is 30 to 40 miles west of Cleveland in Oberlin, Ohio. And you'll hear people refer to the centers as Oberlin Center or Hampton Center or Aurora Center, but it's really Chicago, Atlanta, and Cleveland centers. Oh, and they employ about 400 plus employees at each one of these. Cleveland Center has the most. They were up to, at one point in time, 550 air traffic controllers working at Cleveland Center. So let's talk about terminal. Now I'm going to break terminal down into different categories. You have the air traffic control tower. You have the radar tower cab. We have a air traffic control tower and approach control. We have large TRACON, a standalone building, terminal radar approach control, and there's one that I don't have a slide for over there. It's called the Super TRACON, which I'll talk about in more detail in a minute. So let's talk about the air traffic control tower. That's that stick located on the airport, stands up out in the middle of Airport Day. You guys have all seen a tower. So that's located on the airport today, and I'll explain later why we say today. Controllers rely upon natural vision, binoculars, and in some cases, bright radar scope. And what that bright radar scope is an extension of their eyes. So think about it. They're looking outside windows. They're looking out to see airplanes. But they can't tell when airplanes are closer in, further away because of the size of the airplanes in three-dimensional airspace. So they use a bright radar scope that's normally hung from the ceiling or in a console to see where the airplane's at, they're going to sequence. See, they don't really separate airplanes in the tower cab. They can't look out and separate airplane. What they do is they sequence the airplane. They provide sequencing for landing and departing aircraft and runway separation for arrival and departure aircraft. And the way they do that is if I'm flying into my local airport, I would call up, say, McCollum Airport, November 808 Mike Whiskey, 10 miles to the north, inbound for landing. They would say 808 Mike Whiskey, roger, enter a left downwind or enter a right downwind for a specific runway. They're pinpointing where they want me to go and where they want me to enter the airspace. Because if there's another airplane coming in from another direction, they're going to say, you're number 2 to follow the Cherokee that's on a 5-mile downwind or whatever the case may be. They sequence the airplanes coming into that airspace. That's the job of the air traffic control tower. Let's talk about the air traffic control tower and an approach control. Now these can be separate facilities or they can be in one building. And I'll talk more about how they come out. In addition to air traffic control services, they provide approach control services. The facility is an up and down. The controller is trained to work in VFR tower and in approach control at the same time. Approach control services may be radar or non-radar. Again, depending on the terrain and the radar coverage, they might have to provide non-radar services also. And some of the locations are Charlotte, Wichita, Kansas, South Bend, Indiana, and Kansas City International. Pretty good size airport, Charlotte, still up and down facility. What happens when they get too busy, we break them apart. We take the approach control and make it a separate entity from the air traffic control tower. The last one we did that at was Orlando. Orlando had got too many positions within the tower and within the approach control, so we made it 2 separate entities. We actually built a new building and moved the TRACON into that new building. So now the controllers either work the tower or they work the approach control, but they no longer go up and down between the two. When it's a standalone building, or it could be co-located, but it's going to be a separate entity, it's a terminal radar approach control. It's a standalone or co-located with a control tower. Radar approach control environment only, so the controller never sees the aircraft which they provide the service for. The airspace coverage is 35 miles and greater, and just some examples of these are Dallas, Denver, Detroit, and Pensacola. Detroit, for example, we had built a brand new tower cab and a brand new approach control in one building. So they are together in one building, but there are 2 separate facilities, 2 different sets of managers, 2 different sets of controllers, 2 different sets of supervisors. Then you go to Pensacola, just the opposite. They're actually in 2 separate buildings, but they're one facility. They don't have one manager, one set of supervisors, one set of controllers, and they actually work at different buildings, different days. So a Super TRACON is just a little bit bigger. It's almost like a mini center. About 250 air traffic controllers work in a building this size. It's a standalone building off airport. It provides approach control services in high density metropolitan areas. So just think about where those are at, and that's where you typically have a very large TRACON. Radar coverage is large geographical area. This particular one is the Southern Cal TRACON. It was one of the first ones, but not the first one of the first ones we combined up. And we did a lot of that for economic reasons. We wanted to take the smaller approach controls that were maintenance headaches, if you will, because they're spread out across the area of Southern California. We put them into one building. So all the controllers that run all the approach control for Southern California operate out of this building. They go from coverage from far north Los Angeles to south of San Diego. So that, again, that was not the first one. The very first one we ever did is called N90, or the New York TRACON. Now there, because you've got White Plains, LaGuardia, JFK, Newark, Teterboro, all those airports so close together, the reason why we combined up those approach controls is because we needed a common eye. We actually called it the common eye. It gave us a common eye for all the airplanes coming into those New York metropolitan areas. One of the other ones we did is A80. It's the Atlanta Large TRACON. It's located in Peachtree City, Georgia. It provides approach control to Atlanta, but also Columbus, Georgia, and Macon, Georgia. Much smaller airports, but we combined those all up. Now out in Chicago, we were going to put in Chicago TRACON, we built a brand new building out in Elgin, Illinois, and we were going to combine up Moline, Rockford, Illinois, Madison, Wisconsin, Milwaukee, and put them all into one building. But that was 1994. If you went out there today at Chicago TRACON, the only thing in Chicago is Chicago. Kind of go into a whole discussion about that. So let's talk about flight service stations. Now we have two kinds of flight service stations. We have automated flight service stations, and we have flight service stations that are automated. So what do I mean by that? So the automated flight service stations are only in the lower 48. There used to be 56 of them. We've reduced that number down to 2. There are 2 left. They're basically call centers for pilots like me that want to call up and get my information from a flight service station, also on the web. Flight service stations that are automated now are all in Alaska. There's 13 of them up there. The 13 that are up there are owned and operated by the FAA. The 2 that are in the lower 48 are operated by Lockheed Martin, today called Leidos. So that's the real big difference. Now the reason why these stayed as active flight service stations in Alaska is because of the pilot community up there. The general aviation population needed that service. And when you look at their services that they provide, you'll see why. They do recorded telephone, face-to-face pre-flight briefings. They distribute NOTAMs, pilot reports, and airman reports, which are significant weather for airmen like myself, small airplanes. It relay ATC clearances, does weather observations and broadcasts, receives and process IFR, VFR flight plans, do airport advisory services when they're located on the airport, which in Alaska most of them are, and they initiate search and rescue. Big job. That's why the 13 in Alaska have stayed working. Some other facilities. We're going to talk about the ATC SCC, too long of acronym. It's the Air Route Traffic Control System Command Center. We shorten it and just call it the Command Center. Makes sense, right? And what they do is they help us flow the correct number of airplanes to any given airport at any given time. Due to weather, due to mechanical, or just because it's overscheduled, we put in ground delay programs to flow the right number of airplanes to those airports. There's 2 places in the NAS we do that every day. Typically at LaGuardia in the morning, we put in a ground delay program right away because there's more airplanes scheduled to go there than what they can land. And rather than holding them to get into the airport, we don't want them to depart. So we send out what's called an edict, estimated departure clearance time. And that tells the pilot, you can depart at this time to arrive at LaGuardia within a 15-minute window. That way we don't overburden, we don't exceed capacity for the demand. In other words, we don't want too many airplanes arriving at once. So that's LaGuardia, we almost do it every day, and that's just normal for that airport. If an airport like in Atlanta gets impacted with weather or impacted mechanical, they shut down a runway, then we have to put a ground delay program in for a place like even Atlanta that's got 5 parallel runways. Now out west, there's a place that almost every morning we have to put a ground delay program in for. Any ideas? Steve? San Francisco. Why San Francisco? What happens every morning at San Francisco? Fog rolls in. When the fog rolls in, you can't line the airplanes. Now, San Francisco has 2 parallel runways, but they're so close together, we have to treat them like one runway. Now, if it's VFR, when it's clear, we can run them together like that. When it's not, they got to go like in trail. You can't have the same capacity, so you lower the demand by putting in a ground delay program. Now, they're very famous. The command center is very famous for one event that took place of where they did a full ground stop. They put everybody on the ground, 9/11, right? When we did that, all airplanes were put on the ground. Anybody that was in the air had to land at the nearest airport. Anybody that was on the ground couldn't take off. So that's the command center. That's kind of their big job. But they work with the local facilities, both your tower and TRACONs at the local airport, to help facilitate that ground delay program. Some other facilities, the Williams J. Hughes Technical Center, that's where we do a lot of our beta testing. It's also where we have a standalone tower, a TRACON, and a center. So if we want to do human-in-the-loop testing, if we're going to put in new keyboards at a facility, we do human-in-the-loop testing at that facility to make sure that we're getting the right keyboard, if that's what we're putting in. Mike Maroney Aeronautical Center, that's located out in Oklahoma City, and that's where we do the controller checkout process, right? Whether we're going to hire somebody or not. Because when we send people there to get trained, they're not hired until after they're successful going through the training. So once they're successful, then that's when we hire them. And there's some radars here that we have. We have the 7, 8, 9, 11 radars. Terminal radars update 4.5 to 6 seconds. Much faster moving radar sites. Now they look like this, but they can look like that. What's the difference between these two? Nothing, other than this one's got a dome over it and that one doesn't. They're the same radar sites. Now on our long-range radars, the slower moving ones, they're typically on top of mountain ranges and places that get cold and get bad weather. So we always put the dome over our long-range radars that are sitting on top of those mountains. And that is it for ATC 101. So I'm going to move right into airspace. And so we'll start that class. Airspace classes. So this is ICAO standard. So the only one that's missing here is we don't have an F airspace. We have A, B, C, D, and E, and G airspace, no F. There is an F airspace in ICAO, but there's not any in the United States. We don't use that. So I'm going to only talk about these 6. First one is, there's 2 things I'm going to talk about with this. The type of airspace and how it pertains to pilots and how it pertains to controllers, because they're different. Class A airspace, for example, it's above 18,000 feet, and I actually should say flight level 180, up to flight level 600. That's Class A airspace. It's positive controlled airspace, which means anybody flying that has to talk to ATC. As a pilot, though, I have to have a clearance, I have to have an instrument rating, and the airplane has to be instrument qualified. If any of those 3 things don't happen, I'm not allowed to fly above flight level 180. As a controller, though, if I'm don't have these credentials, but I call up ATC and I say, I want to climb to flight level 190, they don't ask me if I'm qualified. They assume that I know the rules and regulations and that I'm going to fly up in that airspace and I'm qualified to do so. So they're going to clear me up there, and then they're going to maintain positive control of me, keeping me separated from other airplanes. You have to, of course, have 2-way radio communications. And so that's Class A airspace. I won't go into too much more. Class B airspace looks like an upside down wedding cake. I use the acronym for this as BIG. That's the way I remember it, because what we want to do is keep big airplanes in, small airplanes out. To fly into here, there are certain requirements you have to have, but the biggest number one is you have to have a clearance to fly into the airspace. And so think about it, your big airplanes are coming in from the flight levels, they come into the upside down wedding cake, and they're going to land at this airport down in the valley, if you will. Any place around here is where your smaller airplanes are going to be located. So here's some of the requirements. You have to have an ATC clearance to get in there. You can't just willy-nilly fly through that airspace. You have to have a clearance to go in there. You have to be a private or a student certification with local restrictions. There's some places that won't allow any student pilots to go in, but for the most part, all you have to do is have a sign-off by a flight instructor to fly into those places. Not sure why we want to do that, but you can. 2-way radio communication. There is special VFR allowed. The visibility minimum is 3 statute miles. You have to maintain clear of clouds, and VFR separation is provided. So if there's 2 airplanes, one's IFR, one VFR, you're going to be separated by the Class B airspace. So as controller goes, they're maintaining almost a positive control airspace in this Class B airspace also. Class C airspace is a little bit smaller place. I use the C as stands for communication, because in order to fly into Class C airspace, I have to establish radio communications. So if I'm flying into Indianapolis, for example, I'd say Indianapolis approach, November 808 Mike Whiskey is inbound, and they'd say 808 Mike Whiskey stand by. Well, I've got my 2-way communications established, I can fly into that airspace. What I'm really looking for is whether they say remain clear of Class C or 808 Mike Whiskey Roger. That's enough so I can fly through this or into this airspace. It's a little bit smaller. It's not a full upside down wedding cake. It's kind of like one layer of cake. That's Class C airspace. Some of the restrictions, again, prior to a radio communications, not a lot of other changes. The minimum cloud distance, 500 foot below, 1,000 foot above, 2,000 foot horizontal from all clouds. That's if you're going to be VFR. If you're an IFR airplane, of course you can fly in the clouds as much as you need to. Class D airspace is only when there's an operating air traffic control tower. So if the air traffic control tower closes at night, the Class D airspace goes away. It's a circle of 5 miles, circle up to 4,000 feet. That's the dimension of a Class D airspace. It's only around an operational airport with an operational air traffic control tower is Class D airspace. You have to have a clearance to go in it. Typically you would because you're going in there to land, and it is prior to a communications again. You can have a student pilot, and again the same requirements, 3 statute miles, 500 foot below, 1,000 foot above, 2,000 horizontal from all the clouds. So the controller doesn't care what kind of pilot I am. However, if I'm a student pilot, I'm going to tell them I'm a student pilot. They're a little more forgiving, and they talk a little slower when you tell them you're a student pilot going in there. Class D airspace. Class E airspace. This is kind of everywhere is the big E. Everywhere that there isn't A, B, C, D, or G. That's everywhere. It actually starts at either 700 or 1,200 feet above the ground and goes up to flight level 180, 17,999. And then again, it starts at flight level 600 and goes to infinity, is Class E airspace. To flying into Class E airspace, you got to look at it as being it's a controlled airspace, which means ATC cares about who's flying here. But really, they only care if I'm a VFR flight following airplane or if I'm an IFR aircraft. If I'm just wanting to fly VFR through this airspace, I have certain requirements that I have to have 3 statute miles of visibility, and I have to have 500 feet below, 1,000 feet above, 2,000 horizontal from all the clouds. If I'm VFR, I can fly where I want to fly in Class E airspace. If I'm going to fly IFR, now I've got to establish 2A radio communications with ATC, and they're going to clear me to fly through the clouds, if there are clouds there. Or if I want to deviate, if it's a big cloud like a thunderstorm and I want to deviate around it, I'm going to ask ATC for a deviation around the weather that happens to be ahead, and they'll allow that deviation as they can. And the last one's Class G airspace. I go with G for ground because it's close to the ground. It starts at 700 feet or 1,200 feet and goes down to the ground. So very minimal airspace. It's actually allows airplanes to, if they got to relocate an airplane between 2 airports, for example, I really consider this to be scud running because you're staying low to the ground. It's uncontrolled airspace, means nobody owns it, and you're flying from point A to point B, below, and you only need 1 statute mile visibility. So think about that. You're low to the ground, you got a mile statute visibility, and what do I have to do cloud requirement wise? I just have to maintain clear of clouds. There's no 500 feet below, 1,000 feet above. So 1 mile visibility, clear clouds. At night, this changes to 3 statute mile. That's the only difference. But it's considered scud running. That's Class G airspace. This is what it looks like put all together. You can see Class A airspace, 18,000 to flight level 600. From 10,000 to 14,000 is 5 mile statute miles visibility is what I need. Below that's 3 statute mile visibility in Class E airspace. But here's your Class B, your Class C, Class D. There's the airport. It's down the ground. You can see your Class G now. Class G is all the way over top of mountains. It's 1,200 feet typically, 700 feet if it gets close to an airport. That is it. That is ATC 101 and airspace. Any questions from anybody?
Good to go. I loved it. Can you roll the commercial, David? was great, thank you. I didn't even get the timing on it, how long was it?
I didn't either.
That's a good question. So when you said when pilots
La conexión humana agrega valor a nuestras vidas. Es un sentido de pertenencia que nos motiva.
Mike Whiskey.
Muchas veces las conexiones que buscamos parecen estar fuera de nuestro alcance y embarcamos en un viaje siguiendo una nueva vida o para forjar nuevas memorias.